Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Paul Rudensky. I'm the Senior Director for Education and Visitor Services here at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I am pleased to welcome all of you to today's professional development program, which is part one of our series, Teaching the Holocaust Through Film. Today's session will focus on feature films. I just wanted to say a few thoughts about the topic before I hand the mic over to our speaker. As the Holocaust recedes into the past, the challenge of making it relevant and accessible becomes ever greater. One powerful category of resources that we can use in teaching include films and videos. These can be powerful tools to tell stories in a concise and moving format. Yet they come with their own set of challenges. For example, there are thousands of films out there. How do we determine which ones will be appropriate to share with our classes? How do we, does a film or movie have to tell a true story, or can a fictional account also have value? And we have such limited time in our classrooms. Which parts of the film should we select for greatest impact? We hope that this three-part seminar will help answer these and other questions and give you more tools for your pedagogic toolbox. We are looking forward to a meaningful and productive program today and over the next three sessions, over this session and the next two sessions. In order to maximize our experience together, we ask you for the following. So please stay with us for the whole program. I promise you it will be interesting. This will also help maximize the number of CTLE credit hours you will learn. It's a good idea to take notes. You know that already. After the program today, we will be sending out an evaluation and a CTLA form. Please take a few minutes to complete the form. Your feedback is important to us and helps us to develop more and better programs for you. Also, if you wish to receive CTLE credit, please make sure that your screen name matches the name that you will use to apply for the credit. I'd like to take a moment to do a shout out for my colleagues, Rachel Litt, who unfortunately is not with us at the moment, and Aliyah Shon, both who were critical in bringing this program together. And a special shout out to Professor Avinoam Patt, who will be speaking to us today, and also who really helped develop this program. The program is part of the Fania Gottesfeld Heller and Joseph Heller Professional Development Series and is made possible through the sponsorship of Dr. Jacqueline Heller in memory of her parents, Fania Gottesfeld Heller Zichrono Livracha and Joseph Heller Zichrono Livracha, of blessed memory. And also through the support of the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany. This program is co-sponsored by the New York University Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism. Today's session will be led by Professor Avinoam Patt, who is the Maurice Greenberg Professor of Holocaust Studies at New York University. Professor Patt previously held the Doris and Simon Konover Chair of Judaic Studies at the University of Connecticut, where he served as the director of the Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life. From 2007 to 2019, he was the Feltman Professor of Modern Jewish History at the University of Hartford, where he served as the director of the Museum of Jewish Civilization. He also previously worked as the Lerman's Applied Research Scholar for Jewish Life and Culture at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Professor Patt's newest book, Israel and the Holocaust, was published by Bloomsbury Press as part of its Perspectives on the Holocaust series in 2024. This is just one of our many professional development programs for educators, and we hope you will join us for our other programs as well. Our next session of this series will be on April 21st, and will focus on teaching the Holocaust using documentaries, and will be led by Professor Marcia Rock and Karen Frankel. We will finish the series with a third session, which will be led by Avi Patt on May 4th, and that will be focusing on using recorded survivor testimony in the classroom. Also in May, we have an exciting program that shows how to use some of the tools available for free from the museum in your classroom. Stay tuned for more offerings later in the spring and throughout the summer. For more information and to register for any of these events, please check your email for our e-blast featuring our professional development programs, or go to our website at www.mjhnyc.org and click events. Please make sure your screen name matches your personal name so that we will have an accurate record of your attendance. So without any further ado, I'm pleased to hand the mic over to Professor Avinoam Patt. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Great. Thank you so much, Paul, and thank you to all the educators who have joined us for the program today. It's an honor for me to be here and a pleasure to see you all virtually over Zoom to have this conversation specifically on the types of resources that we can use for teaching the Holocaust using feature films. In a moment, I will share my screen to share a PowerPoint with you and also to share some clips as I go forward. What I hope to do is spend about 40 minutes or so sharing some ideas, thoughts, suggestions for how to use feature films in the classroom and a number of films for us to think about how we might use them in the classroom. I should say right off the bat that, as Paul suggested, there are so many films that are out there that obviously will not be able to cover all of them, and will not probably cover some that you already have in mind. But we will have plenty of time for Q&A, and maybe we can spend some time in our discussion discussing different types of film, different genres, different things, and think about the appropriateness or whether or not they would work in the classroom. As was noted as well by Paul, this series is co-sponsored by the NYU Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism, and I'm very happy that our next session on April 21st, Marcia Rock and Karen Frankel will be able to talk about teaching the Holocaust through documentaries and spend some time talking about a new documentary film that Marcia and Karen have just collaborated on called Family Treasures. And one last thing before I share my screen, you'll see in the chat that I have included information about an upcoming event next Monday at the NYU Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism on March 31st that will feature one of the scholars whose work I'm going to reference today, Alan Marcus, who is a professor of education at the University of Connecticut, whose chapter I will reference today from a book that I co-edited on teaching the Holocaust through film. Alan will be at NYU both in person and then doing a virtual presentation, which you can join in webinar format as well, specifically on how to use virtual survivors, the Shoah Foundation's Dimensions and Testimony project, in the classroom. So this very much overlaps with some of the material that we'll be talking about. So I wanted to mention that event next Monday, March 31st at 4 p.m. Okay. So I'm sharing my screen, teaching the Holocaust with feature films. And what I'd like to do in the time that we have now is for us to think a little bit about the types of films that are out there, how we might use them in the classroom, questions that we might ask when we consider sort of which types of films to use in the classroom, what is the best way to make use of these films in the classroom, and specifically think about what are our goals as we are approaching teaching of the Holocaust, and whether or not these films that we would employ in the classroom help us meet our educational goals. So I want us to think about how we choose and evaluate the materials that we use when teaching about the Holocaust, not only feature films, but also more broadly, different forms of literature, different forms of material, both creative fiction and nonfiction, documents that are archival sources, creative literature that we might use in the classroom. How do we use those? Are they trustworthy sources for learning about the Holocaust? How can we best use them in the classroom? And do they fulfill our educational goals when we approach using them in the classroom? How do we determine which fictional sources, whether they be literature or in the topic of what we're talking about today, specifically feature films, can be used most effectively as educational resources for teaching about the Holocaust? So we have a chat function in our webinar today, and I know some of you are putting in your names and titles for the CTLE credits, but I'm also quite curious, and I'm sure many in the audience will be quite curious to hear about which films and works of literature. So let's focus specifically on which films you use to teach the Holocaust. Although I will say that in a lot of my teaching, so you can use the chat function to type that in a lot of my teaching, sometimes we have the opportunity to have works in conversation with one another, right? So if I were to do a work that talks about, for example, teaching about the Warsaw Ghetto, we could have a text, nonfiction or literary text, and have that be in conversation with a feature film. Or there are plenty of films that deal with the subject of Auschwitz. Again, have a text and a film in conversation with one another. Same thing for stories of the Kindertransport. Same thing for stories of refugees. So think about how to have different works of film and literature in conversation with one another. And I'll come back to talking about this. I should say that right off the bat, I'm aware that there are certain challenges that present themselves when we think about how to use these works in their teaching about the Holocaust. I might be able to teach a class at a university level where I have the luxury of having a 14-week semester to deal in depth with background history of the Holocaust and then have a feature film that I might use to supplement the time that I have in the classroom. But I'm also aware that sometimes we might have a day, a week, maybe 2 weeks, and are trying to fit this work into a broader lesson that we don't have a lot of time. So we have to think about how valuable our time is and what are the works, the sources that we can use that best fulfill our learning goals or educational outcomes that we desire. And does that film that we choose to use in the classroom fulfill our goals for that? I think one thing for us to always think about, and it's quite interesting when we think about teaching the Holocaust, it might seem on some level self-evident. Why do we teach the Holocaust? But the truth is that when we start to ask this question of teachers, we get a lot of different answers for why do we teach the Holocaust. There are, of course, those answers that might deal with, well, there is an obligation of memory, this obligation to fulfill the commandment of Zachor, to remember. You will have some teachers who say, well, it is a basic historical fact that every student should know. This deals with historical knowledge, or specifically knowledge of the events of the Holocaust or the events of World War II. But then we get other responses that deal with either fostering empathy, confronting a difference, respecting the other, creating a culture of diversity, speaking out against discrimination. We get responses that address the question of protecting and defending democratic ideals, fighting fascism. You'd be surprised, or maybe you wouldn't be surprised, that there are many different criteria, there are many different motivations with which we can think about how we construct our learning goals and whether they fulfill the obligation of why we teach the Holocaust. And so again, if we think about sort of what are our desired learning outcomes, and do we use these fills to fit those outcomes, the question or the answer to these questions might affect the types of sources that we use to teach the topic. I'm showing you a poster, which I won't spend a lot of time on, but what I will say is that already from the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, there was a sense of an obligation on the part of the surviving population. This is a poster that was created by the Central Historical Commission of Survivors in post-war Germany, the obligation to remember what Amalek has done unto you. And then you can see the skeleton pointing to the bottom, telling survivors, collect and record, offer your testimony, document what happened. Why? Because you have an obligation to the 6 million who did not survive to tell your story and to tell their stories. And I'm showing this to you because this is an early example that we can see of a visual representation of the obligation to remember. This idea of using sort of a multimedia format, in this case, a poster announcing to the surviving population, you, survivors, have an obligation to remember. You have an obligation to record your history. How have Jews remembered throughout Jewish history? By writing it down, by recording it, by retelling the story, just as is done on the Passover Seder, just as is done in the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, the expulsion from Spain, from other historical events, that we can use testimonies that are recorded to share the stories of those who did not survive and share the stories of those who did survive, to tell and retell those stories. This is something that comes from the obligation to remember, right? But again, as I've suggested before, this is not always the reason that we see this. I'm showing you here, and I won't show the clip, but probably one of the earliest, if not the earliest, feature film created in the aftermath of the Holocaust to dramatize the events of the Holocaust was a film called Lang ist der Weg, Long is the Road, created in 1948 by survivors of the Holocaust, actually in post-war Germany, in a displaced persons camp called Landsberg, by Yisrael Becker, who you can see here in the middle, who plays a character by the name of David, who has survived the war, survived being in the Warsaw Ghetto, escaped from a deportation train. He does not know whether his parents have survived the war. His parents, who he knows have been deported from the ghetto to a concentration camp. He does not know what has happened to his mother and his father, and much of the film dramatizes not only the experiences of the war, but the aftermath of the war, the uncertainty of not knowing what has happened to one's family, and the drama of trying to reconnect in the aftermath of the war. I say it's one of the earliest dramatizations because it is a case where we see in a feature film survivors of the Holocaust creating a film, actors acting this out, dramatizing creation of the ghettos, escape from a moving train to escape deportations, the selection process that would have taken place in Auschwitz, and then joining the partisans, all sorts of elements of the wartime experience, dramatized in a feature film, remarkably created by survivors themselves in 1948. So again, if we think about this sort of obligation to remember, or the question of whether this is what motivates the teaching, the obligation to remember that a genocide has taken place and also remember the individual human lives affected by that genocide, we have to think about sort of this choice of what do we remember, why do we remember, and how do we remember? And I would argue that films can play a very important role in this process of helping students learn, of helping to remember what has happened, of fulfilling an educational goal of teaching about the history through film. It's not something that I say we should never use. There are ways in which we can use it very, very effectively, but I want us to think about the most effective ways to make use of these tools. And I would say that I also situate this within a broader context of sort of other works that are works of literature that we use in the classroom, both diaries that are created, documentation projects, memoirs, poetry, film, journalism, newspapers, music, novels, fiction, and nonfiction as well, that we can use to supplement our teaching in the classroom. And again, we have to ask that central question again and again. Does this support our desired learning outcomes? Does this support the goals that we aspire to achieve in the teaching of this material? As I mentioned in the beginning, some of what I'll be sharing with you today about teaching with film is based specifically on a chapter from a volume that I've edited, which you can see here, Understanding and Teaching the Holocaust. And in the book, we have a chapter by Alan Marcus, who'll be speaking at NYU next week, called The Gray Zone, a reference to the film The Gray Zone of Holocaust Education, Teaching with Film. And there's a very helpful chapter that Alan has written where he asks us to consider sort of the types of films that we might use. So what are the criteria? First of all, we have to establish a lesson goal and then think about, is the film the best possible source to meet that lesson goal? We have to, when we choose a film, determine the film's ability to develop historical empathy. Does it help us appropriately develop empathy for our characters, for the history that we're trying to represent? With which characters does a film want the viewer to empathize and why, right? What perspective is it presenting? We can't present all perspectives. What is it emphasizing? What is left out from what is not emphasized? What perspective on the history of the Holocaust is represented and what is left out? And I'll show you some specific examples to think about this. Are the historical figures that are represented in the film, are they represented accurately, right? Is this based in solid historical research? And are they shown to be complicated, multidimensional figures? Or, as often is the case, are these historical figures represented with less complexity just to present sort of a good versus evil representation, which is very common when we see sort of films about the Holocaust. Do these representations complicate our understanding of the past? Do they distort this notion of near perfect heroes or evil villains, or do they represent them in their complexity? Other criteria for us to consider. Does the film depict alternative perspectives on history in contrast to what students might otherwise see in their textbooks or regular lessons? Does the film determine whether political, social, and ideological values reflected in the film, do they overly distort the historical narrative, or can they effectively be used as part of the activities with the film? We also always, and this is so important to me as a historian, have to verify the film's adherence to the historical record. Now, of course, right, a feature film is a fictionalization by definition. The dialogue is going to be fictionalized. Certain elements of the history are going to be fictionalized. But is it constructed against a background of historical fact? Are the events that are represented in the film historically plausible? Will they not distort what our students are learning and confuse them about the actual history because they are misrepresenting the history that has taken place? Again, I will show some examples of films that I think do this well and examples of film that are quite dangerous because they do not do this well. Um, Again, does the film establish that any fictional elements in the film, if they choose to fictionalize certain things, if they choose to create composite characters, which often happens when you have to compress time in a film, do those composite characters enhance the film and not distort the history that is represented? Right. So these are all things to think about. And as we talked about in the beginning, are there other resources that we can use together with the film? Can we present the film in conversation with a diary, with a memoir, with a historical text, with something that will allow for a learning activity where students can compare the representations in one source versus the other? Will it enable them to think critically about the material? So let's go through a few things for us to consider before I go into some specific examples, a few things for us to consider about how we can choose which films to use when teaching the Holocaust and using film. Now, obviously, we know that film is a unique historical text, right? Movies can be used educationally if they are used well. As we've said, right, we can use these to build historical literacy. We can connect it to learning goals. We can tie it to other learning activities beyond just watching the film. Of course, there are risks that we have talked about. Sometimes you can conflate imaginary and real people, right? So think about the fictionalization of different characters versus a film like Europa, Europa, which is dedicated specifically to representation of an actual historical figure's experiences during the war. Of course, one of the things that we always have to be aware of, and this happens all the time when we create films, is sometimes the considerations of the present might color the ways in which the representations of the past are presented. And again, I'll show you some examples of films that do this well and films that I think we have to be careful with in terms of thinking about that. Again, if we only have a limited amount of time and we're only using a film, how much content knowledge do our students have? Will the film misrepresent their understanding of historical events? What can we use to supplement their knowledge of historical events so that they have the best possible understanding of the film that they are seeing? Another thing for us to consider, why are you using the film? Are we using the film to teach the history of the Holocaust? Or are we using the film to explore the complexities of human behavior? Two very different criteria to consider when we think about how we're using a film. Are we using it to raise and teach difficult history, something that I would argue is important for us to do? Are we using it to explore moral and ethical dilemmas? Again, something that can be done effectively using film, but think about why you're using the film before you use the film. Just one note, and I haven't even looked at the chat as to whether this came in as a response, but Alan, in his chapter in Understanding and Teaching the Holocaust, writes very specifically that he thinks we should never use the boy in the striped pajamas to teach about the Holocaust. Specifically, that he says that while it's chosen because it's represented by the author John Boyne as a fable that has less violence, that is easier to watch. We can think about sort of why this might be chosen. Students can relate to the main characters in the film. These are some of the reasons that the film has been chosen by teachers and can be quite popular in terms of the usage of the film. There are numerous problems with the boy in the striped pajamas, including the fact that it is historically inaccurate. It's narrow in the perspectives that are presented. It is misleading. It misrepresents the Holocaust. It perpetuates certain myths. There are gross distortions in terms of how the film is represented, including the implausibility of an 8-year-old Bruno, the German boy who lives next to an extermination camp where his father is the commander, the implausibility of sneaking away from his house across the wire fence to befriend a boy named Shmuel, the Jewish prisoner, his age. The idea that the film provides a lack of voice for Jewish victims, not to mention other victims, including Romani, disabled, homosexual, political prisoners, are almost invisible. The British historian David Cesarani also criticizes the film, and I'll just read his critique here, because it, quote, justifies the post-war claim of Germans that they knew nothing about what happened to the Jews. The book is full of Germans who know nothing, and if they do, heartily disapprove. Cesarani writes, this is not fable, it is fiction in the worst sense of the word. There are other inaccuracies, including sort of the effects of Zyklon B gas, the ways in which the boys meet frequently and for so long. Again, but again, this is a case where we can think about sort of why the film is popular and why it might sort of give voice to certain ways in which individuals or groups would want to represent the Holocaust, including the idea that the character of Bruno ultimately is sacrificed for the sins of the father. So you can think about certain religious overtones that are present in the film and why that might be appealing. So again, if we think about sort of which films to choose, we want to have strict adherence to the historical record. We'd like to see minimal use of fictional elements. We'd like to see reliance on historical evidence and scholarship when creating the film. There's a number of examples I'll provide that do a good job of this. Ideally, we will see films that represent the ability to develop historical empathy, to understand the complexities that the characters face at the time. And we want historical figures to be represented accurately and shown to be complicated, multidimensional figures. And ideally, the films should depict alternative perspectives on history in contrast to what students might otherwise see in their textbooks or regular lessons, right? Films can be very powerful in compressing a lot of history into a 2-hour approximately time period that can be quite powerful, but we want to make sure that it doesn't distort what they're learning in the classroom and enhances what they might learn in the classroom. Again, another thing to take into account, the political, social, and ideological values reflected in the film, we want to make sure they do not overly distort the historical narrative and can be effectively used as part of activities within the film. And I'll, again, I promise you, I'm going to get to some examples, but sometimes we can see and we should be aware of the ways in which certain presentist motivations might influence the representations of the history, sometimes I would argue for political purposes. And I'll go into the zone of interest in a moment to discuss sort of some of the issues that I see with some of the choices that the director makes in this film in terms of how it represents Auschwitz in particular. Again, as we've said, we have to make sure that the film clearly supports the goals of the lesson and that the genre of the film is appropriate. And I'm happy to discuss in the Q&A Life is Beautiful or Jojo Rabbit, films where there are questions about sort of historical representation, representing things that, of course, are not plausible in the way the film is represented, but also the question of When is it appropriate to use humor in the context of these films? How does it represent the history? And certain types of genre confusion that we might see in a film like Life is Beautiful or Jojo Rabbit that might also be quite confusing for students as a historical text to teach about this history. Okay, so with that sort of preview of sort of some of the considerations for us to think about, I want us to think about which types of films can be used effectively for which purposes. So what are we trying to teach? And again, to go back about why teach the Holocaust, there are many different lessons that we can try to teach when we teach about the Holocaust. But I think we should think about which perspective we're trying to represent when we teach the Holocaust. So, for example, when we teach the Holocaust, and this is a very common question that students have, right? How did the Germans organize the final solution? And usually that's part of a broader question about how did the Holocaust happen? And it's usually part of a question that students have about the nature of human evil, right? Who would do this? How could people engage in mass murder? It's trying to understand sort of the motivations of the perpetrators. And of course, this has been part of a broad and wide-ranging debate in historical studies about the Holocaust, about trying to understand more broadly perpetrator motivation. Were Germans Hitler's willing executioners in the Goldhagen thesis who were so consumed by a desire to engage in mass murder and this eliminationist anti-Semitism that they had imbibed in Nazi Germany that they couldn't wait for the opportunity to engage in mass murder? Or were they ordinary men, not so different from human beings alive today, who were put into a situation, an extraordinary situation during the Second World War, in which almost any ordinary human being put into that situation could be turned into a mass murderer, which is sort of the alternative thesis represented by Christopher Browning in his book Ordinary Men, which some of you might use in your teaching, in which there are other social psychological forces like obedience to authority, conformity, soldiers being confronted with the brutality of the war, that we can understand the ways in which ordinary Germans can become mass murderers in the context of the Second World War. So if we think about this again, and we think about sort of representations that deal with the question of mass murder and how Germans could become mass murderers, part of this is trying to understand the nature of evil. What does evil look like? Do we know evil when we see it? Are we all capable of evil? And if we can identify evil and we can teach our students to identify evil, do we have a responsibility to stop it? And if so, how, right? What is the goal of this teaching about evil? And of course, some of this debate about the banality of evil goes all the way back to the Eichmann trial and the fascination with the Nazis and the fascination with the bureaucratic nature of the process of mass murder. So I'll give you an example of two films that I think actually very effectively deal with the very bureaucratic nature of the planning of the final solution. Now, part of the problem when we think about sort of genres of film and we think about how to use these films in the classroom, there is the problem of you don't necessarily or you cannot expose your students to violence. And this is a very difficult thing. We're teaching about the Holocaust, we're teaching about mass murder, and yet we have certain concerns of obviously that might be sort of affected by our administration, affected by our district, affected by concerns of what we can show students in the classroom and we can't show them violence. So these two films, Conspiracy, which came out almost 25 years ago now on HBO Films, and The Conference, which is essentially an adaptation of the earlier version, represent no violence, but deal extensively with the planning of the final solution and specifically with the Wannsee Conference. So I'll just show you a brief clip here, if you've never seen it, from Conspiracy with Kenneth Branagh, the distinguished British actor, and we can talk about sort of British actors playing Nazis. That's a thing that happens quite frequently. But Kenneth Branagh playing the part of Reinhard Heydrich, the Nazi who invited the leading figures of Germany in January of 1942 to the Wannsee Conference to outline the planning of the final solution.
I am Heydrich, SS Chief of Reich Security Main Office and Vice Protector of Bohemia and Moravia. And welcome. Today, each of us becomes a bearer of secrets.
Even amongst a group of men who committed the most extraordinary crimes, he was unique for the ferocity and the cruelty and the intensity of what he did.
We have a storage problem in Germany with these Jews. I have been asked to direct the release of Germany and all of Europe from the Jewish stranglehold, and I believe that together we will.
There is never any consideration of any larger moral dimension. Inside the man, there seems to be nothing.
We will not sterilize every Jew and wait for them to die. We will not sterilize every Jew and then exterminate the race. That's fine.
Okay, so that's just to give you a sense of the tone, and Brenna talking about the character of Reinhard Heydrich. The film is a representation of the Wannsee Conference, which actually lasted about 90 minutes, and it is a representation of the discussions at that conference, the very bureaucratic nature of the conversation about mass murder. And this is a case where you could take a text, which is the Protocols of the Wannsee Conference, and have your students read the text of the Protocols of the Wannsee Conference, in which the final solution was essentially outlined, and compare it to the representation in the film, which tries to adhere very closely to the history and represent the concerns and considerations of the various elements of the German state, and also the discussion using euphemistic terms of the final solution. Now, again, this doesn't represent violence, but it does represent the plan for the extermination of European Jewry. And you could compare this, for example, to a film like The Zone of Interest, which is also quite interested in this question of perpetrator motivation. In this case, some of you might have seen it, looking at the character of Rudolf Hess and the family of Hess, the commandant of Auschwitz, and their lives living in Auschwitz. I think I have a clip here just to give you a brief sense for those of you who have not seen it. This is from the trailer, and then I'll include some thoughts on what I think is going on here with this film.
Das ist ja wunderschön. Ja, die Azaleen da. Hier gibt es auch Gemüse. Bisschen Kräuter, auch Rosmarin. Hier ist rote Beete. Das ist Fenchel. Die Sonnenblumen, ja. Und hier ist der Kohlrabi. Die Kinder essen wahnsinnig viel Kohlrabi.
Die herrliche Zeit, die wir im gemütlichen, gastlichen Hause Höss verlebten, wird immer mit zu unseren schönsten Urlaubserinnerungen gehören. Im Osten steht unser Morgen. Herzlichen Dank für eure nationalsozialistische Gastfreundschaft. Heil Hitler!
Okay, so that gives you a sense for The Zone of Interest if you haven't seen it. Again, this is a film that is very much concerned with the banality of evil, is a representation of the commandant of Auschwitz and his family, essentially having very banal experiences of living in the midst of Auschwitz, asks these questions of how could a family live into these circumstances? How could someone oversee the murder of over 1 million people in Auschwitz while having an ordinary life, right? These are all important aspects to ask and things to ask about a character like Rudolf Hess. My critiques of the film, and we can discuss it in the Q&A, have to do with the fact that it only represents Auschwitz behind the wall, right? That is, we don't confront the killing apparatus. We don't confront the mass murder that's taking place. We hear the sounds of it. We see the smokestacks. We see the buildings behind it. But it sort of includes within it this notion of plausible deniability from the perspective of the children, perhaps, or other characters, perhaps. So we're not forced to engage with the question of Auschwitz, just this question of the banality of evil. It's very much focused on forcing us to wrestle with the banality of evil, but I would argue that it doesn't actually force us to consider what's taking place at Auschwitz only indirectly, right? And we can think about sort of the problems with that and why that might be limited and what it represents. Okay, so those are examples of films that deal with sort of the perpetrator perspective, perpetrator motivations. There's lots of other examples. Again, another consideration is subtitles. Is the film presented in German? Is the film presented in English? What does it represent? Sort of these are all things to consider. Of course, there are many films that deal with presenting the perspective of the victims and force us to wrestle with how Jews responded to persecution. And these can be incorporated into lessons about sort of the nature of resistance, the broader spectrum of resistance, spiritual resistance, cultural, educational, religious, political activity to strengthen morale, how these connect to the development and of armed resistance. And there's much to say about this, but you can think about sort of films that represent the Warsaw Ghetto, for example, and even documentary films like Who Will Write Our History, which focuses specifically on Emanuel Ringelblum and the Oyneg Shabbos archive. Again, a documentary film that is based on the book by Sam Casso, specifically on Ringelblum, the creation of the Underground Archive, but actually incorporates within it also certain dramatic elements, right? Because it has both the historians, the talking heads, the historical documentary component to it, and then actors acting out scenes from the history, right? There's a lot of this going on these days. It's very current in the way in which documentary films are being created, where you have historical recreations that are taking place. And of course, our students are always quite interested in the question of resistance and representations of resistance. Interestingly, while I'll talk about The Pianist in a moment as a film that represents the Warsaw Ghetto and the experience of life in the Warsaw Ghetto, I think, quite effectively, we still do not have a feature film that actually dramatizes the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, which is somewhat surprising. Of course, in The Pianist, we have sort of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising in the background. On NBC, in a miniseries, we had Uprising, right, which was sort of an NBC miniseries. But there, and we could talk about this later, why we're sort of missing a feature film about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which we could talk about later. I will show you, though, a brief clip here from The Pianist, which I think quite effectively represents Jewish life in the ghetto, specifically from the perspective of somebody like Władek Szpilman. Again, a case where you could look at a text written by Szpilman and compare it to the way in which the film is represented. And I'll just show you a brief clip here from the film to show what I think is an effective representation of the Warsaw Ghetto.
Well, to tell you the truth, I thought it would be worse.
Sorry about the subtitles.
Where will we sleep?
I'll sleep in the kitchen with the girls. You, Henrik, and Papa in here.
Look. Come and look.
Okay, I will stop it there in the interest of time. I'll just say that I think Polanski, in creating the ghetto or recreating the ghetto for The Pianist, paid a great deal of careful attention to the historical facts and tried to represent the Warsaw Ghetto as accurately as he possibly could. Again, this is of course, a fictionalized recreation of the ghetto, told from the perspective, again, remembering this is told from the perspective of one character. And this is something that we can remind our students of, sort of the experience of the individual versus the experience of the collective. A film is going to show this from the perspective of the individual, but it is, I think, quite faithful to the historical record, and for that reason does it effectively. Of course, what I will say, and we can think about sort of how Jewish characters are represented in feature films, in a lot of cases, in a lot of more recent cases, we do tend to have more secular Jewish characters represented. That is, characters who don't necessarily sort of come from a religious background, somebody who sort of is dealing even more so with the dilemmas of how to live a life according to Jewish law under these circumstances. And we can think about sort of, is this about issues of audience? Is this something that will have a broader popular appeal? Is this something that a broader popular audience can identify with? But this is something to consider when thinking about our students, to think critically about what is represented and what is not represented in the film. Of course, there is a great deal of interest in questions like resistance, in stories of Jewish partisans, for example, and some of you might be quite familiar with a number of the different stories that talk about sort of either ghetto revolts or partisan experiences or films that represent this. Perhaps one of the most well-known films to represent sort of the experiences of Jewish partisans is Defiance by Nechama Tech, which is the book, which I'm holding up if you can see it here, which actually this version of the book, so Nechama writes the book specifically about the Bielski brothers, the Bielskis, who saved over 1,000 Jews in a family camp in the forests of Belarus by helping large numbers of Jews escape from the Novogruda ghetto and other surrounding ghettos, and basically sheltering them deep in the woods away from the Germans and away from the clutches of the Nazi killing machine. The book, as is written by Nechama Tech and is represented in certain ways in the film, focuses on the choice that for the Bielski brothers, rescue, this large-scale rescue plan that they successfully undertake to save over 1,000 Jews, it was more important for them to save Jewish lives than to kill Germans. And the film dramatizes this in the conflict between the two brothers, Tuvia and Zeus. However, in what I think is a dangerous changing of the historical narrative, dramatizes, of course, for a Hollywood audience, you have to have like an action film that dramatizes sort of a battle sequence. So in the end of the film, you have this battle sequence between the Bielskis and German forces. Show this briefly. Daniel Craig, so think about James Bond as action hero fighting the Germans. And they've taken their Jews, and they're hiding in the woods.
Everybody down! Down! Take cover! Take cover! Get down!
Okay, sorry to leave it right there. It's a battle scene in which the Bielskis and this ragtag band of Jewish partisans, composed of Jews hiding in the woods, families hiding in the woods, managed to successfully fight back against German tanks and German firepower. Now, Nechama Tech, I think rightfully so, even though this was based on the history that she had written about the Bielski brothers, objected to this representation in the film because this never happened. The idea that, that the Bielskis were always trying to save Jews, and they knew that if they engaged in frontal combat with the Germans, this would risk Jewish lives. And so there was no battle like this. There was no last fight scene like this. But of course, from Hollywood's perspective, we can see why this is important. So again, we just have to think about getting our students to think critically about the sources and the material that they are consuming. Again, I don't have time to go through all of these, but Son of Saul, another, I think, excellent, but this probably would be very difficult to use in a classroom, not only because the film is in Hungarian, which is fine, students can read subtitles, But also because the history that is represented there, which I think is done quite accurately, but it's very, very difficult material in the ways that it represents sort of the gas chambers, saving or finding a Jewish boy who manages to stay alive for a little bit in the gas chamber, and then the mission of Saul to bury this child. And then its representation of the revolt of the Sonderkommando. Again, this is important history to represent, but we have to wrestle with, can we do this responsibly for our students in terms of the content that we are sharing with them? We can discuss this. Okay, so beyond teaching perpetrators and teaching sort of the experiences of victims, I will just spend a little bit of time talking about how we talk about rescue and its representation in film. I've not included in here examples of films that deal with complex aspects of sort of what we used to call sort of perpetrators, victims, bystanders. So the neighbors and the representations of the neighbors, the responses of the neighbors, but we can talk about this as well. There have been a number of provocative films, in particular out of Poland, that deal with sort of the question of complicity and collaboration. But it just, you can think about sort of, if you choose to use a film that deals with rescue, the popularity of these themes, of course. You know, it is popular to represent rescue and the choice of some to choose to resist evil. Perhaps the most famous example of this is Oskar Schindler and Schindler's List, which actually I found for my undergraduates at NYU, because the film is now over 30 years old. Most of them have not seen the film, and we can talk about sort of the conventions of choices, the black and white, and how Spielberg represents the character of Schindler. But you also have to think about sort of that question that we laid out before of, is this character represented in the case of Schindler, in all of his moral and ethical complexity? Does Spielberg accurately represent the idea of Oskar Schindler being a Nazi party member, the idea of Oskar Schindler profiting off the war for a large part of the war? Does he accurately represent sort of this transformation of Schindler from essentially somebody who's a Nazi party member, somebody who has low moral and ethical standards, to somebody who becomes a rescuer? At the end of the film, we have this scene that essentially tries to capture some of these elements of Schindler's transformation. I'll just show you a brief clip if you remember sort of this dramatic ending of the film with those who are saved by Schindler presenting him with some token of their appreciation.
Hebrew from the Talmud. It says, whoever saves one life saves the world entire.
Okay, so in the interest of time, I'll stop it there just to remind you of sort of what's happening in this scene. Then, Schindler or Liam Neeson will go on to say, this ring could have saved more lives. I didn't do enough. I could have saved more lives. It's a very dramatic moment. It's heart-wrenching. It shows the appreciation of the Jews who were rescued. And then sort of Schindler's transformation into a rescuer who felt like he should have done more. He could have done more. Again, this is a representation. This part of the film, the sort of presentation of the ring, right? These are dramatic representations that try to capture certain moments. They are amalgamations of events that didn't actually happen in the way they're represented in the film. So we then have to wrestle with sort of our students' questions. Did this actually happen? No, this didn't happen in the way that it's represented in the film. Why would the filmmaker represent it this way? And there are certain things that can be usefully done with students, right? To show a film, the Holocaust Museum in Washington, for example, has all sorts of educational resources where you can go and see, okay, what is the actual history of Schindler's List? How does Spielberg represent the history? It can be a very effective lesson. But I would say is we have to build this scaffolding around the lesson to make sure that our students absorb the history clearly and they're not left confused by the history as it's represented in the film. Just a couple of other examples, a more recent film that deals with the story of Nicholas Winton and the rescue of Winton's rescue of children in sort of his own personally organized kinder transport in which he's able to rescue close to 700
We are working
children.
to evacuate these children by train to safety in Britain.
Why are you doing this, Mr. Winton?
Because I may be able to do something about it. I must.
Okay, so again, a recent film that deals with an extraordinary true story of rescue organized by Nicholas Winton. And I always think about sort of why would anyone fictionalize something that deals with the history of the Holocaust when there's so many extraordinary stories to be told that don't have to be fictionalized? And this is a great example of one where you have an extraordinary story, extraordinary efforts that Nicholas Winton goes to, and I think it does it quite effectively. And even recently, we've seen sort of new stories that have come out. You might have seen about sort of documentation of all the names of children who were rescued as part of the kinder transport. You can sort of juxtapose that to a film like this and think about the importance of every single life that is rescued and use a film to teach students about the kinder transport, or compare this to a documentary like Into the Arms of Strangers. Again, there's a lot for us to wrestle with in terms of these films, their critical reception, the ways in which some of these films assist in winning Academy Awards. As I've alluded to, I have great concerns with films that do fictionalize the historical record, like, imagining sort of Jojo Rabbit, imagining Hitler. And as Taika Waititi has said, he creates this Hitler to make fun of this Hitler, but it could be confusing for students in the way that it's represented. Or, again, I personally am a big fan of Inglourious Basterds. I think if sort of you want to fulfill certain revenge fantasies about Jews killing Nazis in the Second World War, Inglourious Basterds is a great film to show that, but it is not a good film for teaching history, right? Because it is a film that, of course, misrepresents the historical record. Your students might watch this film and all think that Hitler died in a burning movie theater in July of 1944, right? So we just have to be careful about sort of what they consume and how the history is represented in that. And my last sort of film that I'm going to end up with before I go to Q&A and discussion, and I want to see all the comments you've put in. Some of you might have seen most recently A Real Pain. And what I'll say about A Real Pain is that it's a film, for those of you who've not seen it, Jesse Eisenberg and Kieran Culkin, sort of on a cousin bonding trip, go to follow their grandmother's journey. Their grandmother is a survivor of the Holocaust. And while the film does not deal directly with the history of the Holocaust, it is one of the best representations that I've seen of another aspect of the history of the Holocaust, which is the question of intergenerational transmission of trauma, right? And what is the impact of that on descendants, on the children and grandchildren of survivors? And there are a few films that have dealt with this, but I think this film does this exceptionally well in terms of dealing with the psychological impact of a grandparent's experience of survival and then how that carries down from generation to generation. And I'll just show you a brief clip here of the film, which takes the characters on a visit to Majdanek, and then also takes them on a visit to Lublin. And this can be quite effective for students to see, like, what do these places look like today for students who might never be able to visit these sites.
So before we head in, I might be a little bit sparser with my information overload today. This is a sacred site where many thousands were murdered, and I think you'll find this place kind of speaks for itself. Okay? Hey. Yeah. These are the barracks. This is the men's bathhouse. He grabbed his whip and herded us towards the bathhouse. There, once our hair was cut and shaved from our entire bodies, we went into the next room. This is the gas chamber. The blue stains on the walls are residue from the deadly gas, Cyclone B.
Okay, I'm gonna stop it there, but I think you can see sort of the ways in which the film, I think, does this quite effectively, right? It includes the viewer on a visit to Majdanek, essentially, as it would be experienced by any tourist visiting Majdanek. In fact, in order to gain access to the camp, Jesse Eisenberg and the film crew had to assure them that they were not creating sort of a dramatic film that was recreating or representing the events of the war, but actually were just documenting sort of a visit to the camp. And in a sense, it sort of, I think, very effectively represents the experience of a visit to what Majdanek looks like today, and also introduces many viewers who would never have a chance to visit Lublin or visit Majdanek to see what the camp looks like today. And you can also note the juxtaposition of historical text, right? So a reading of testimony of someone who was in Majdanek with the space itself, which I think is quite effective as well, and done in a very, I think, responsible and sensitive way that is quite quite effective. So I will end my discussion there, my overview of the different types of films and the different types of material that we can engage when we think about the film. But again, just to reiterate, sort of to think about how we use film in our teaching of the Holocaust, to think about the goals of our lesson, to think about the why and what we want to convey with the materials that we're teaching, to think about, does the film help us accomplish the goals? And then what perspective, right? Do we want to teach our students about the history of the Holocaust? Do we want them to develop empathy and understanding for the experiences of the historical subjects? Do we want them to understand sort of the complexities of human behavior? Are we teaching about perpetrators? Are we teaching about victims? Are we teaching about rescuers, right? So many different things to consider when we think about which films we will use. All right. I will stop myself there, Paul, but I hope that leaves us some time for discussion.
Avi, thank you so much for really the wonderful remarks and that very quick but very meaningful tour of a lot of the really great and more recent and not only the more recent feature films, but most of the more recent feature films dealing with the history of the Holocaust. We have a bunch of questions here in the chat, which I think you can see. I'm happy to pull some out, but if you want, if there's some that you would like to address first, I have no objection.
All right, let me look. Sorry, I'm just scrolling back up. And I appreciate also the sort of crowd sharing of information different ways, right? So Life is Beautiful. I'm sorry, I'm just scrolling down to see what people have listed in terms of the film. The Number on My Grandfather's Arm, which I remember, Paul, there was a exhibition at the Museum of Jewish Heritage as well, right? There was a documentary that uses uh, animation to teach about sort of the a grandchild. Yeah.
Correct. So that actually, I think, used some of the artwork that the exhibition features some of the artwork from that film, from The Number on the Great Grandfather's
Yeah.
Arm.
So, and I'm just reading through some of the comments that have come in. The Garden of the Finzi Contini, excellent. Au revoir les enfants. So, what I will say is, again, there are so many excellent films. And one thing that Alan does at the end of his chapter as well in the Gray Zone of Holocaust Education is include sort of a list of different types of films that he also recommends that he thinks do a good job, although it's something that like constantly has to be updated. So in each of these cases, right, it's and I like that some of the teachers have also included, right, the lessons that they design, right? So for example, you could think about if you have the time or you just have time for one film. So if you're, for example, somebody wrote in here that they use Night. And so if you have your students read Elie Wiesel and Night, what could you pair this with? Or would you focus specifically? So if Ellie's describing sort of experiences in Auschwitz, and then you want to have a film that represents that, right? You can include some clips just as sort of a representation to help our students sort of visualize it. Although sometimes there's the advantage of just doing it with the text itself.
If I could just interrupt, so I don't know everybody. I don't think everybody can see all of the recommendations that are here. So maybe you could.
You're right.
Yeah, I don't think they can. I'm not
Okay.
sure how to set that up. So maybe you can just at least refer
Okay.
to a few of those. I know you did already, but
I will. So my apologies. Right. It's sorry. So I will share this because I think it is quite helpful then that the teachers wrote in the films that they use. And so but just the hosts and panelists can see it. So I mentioned that some of that have been written, The Garden of the Finzi Contini, Au revoir les enfants, which again is a French film that deals with rescue, with hiding, with sheltering of children. I think is an important film that can be used. Someone else wrote in that they use. Michael wrote in that he uses the pianist and then supplements it with documentary films on the Warsaw Ghetto. So, for example, if one has the time and can do a film like Who Will Write Our History and juxtapose that with The Pianist can be very effective. Or so use a text on hunger in the ghetto, like the diary of a single day, and a text that actually comes directly from the Ringelblum archive, and then which actually is covered extensively, the diary of a single day, and the experience of hunger in the ghetto, with Who Will Write Our History, that can be extremely, extremely effective. Just including a few more. We talked about Zone of Interest. If one has time, could do a comparison between Zone of Interest with the Commandant's Shadow, which Michael suggests. Michael also asks, what text would you pair with Defiance? So I will just say that's a great question. So for example, I mentioned the book, Defiance, Nechamatek's book. But of course, this is a 300 page book. And we know that if we can get our students to read 20 pages these days, that's a major accomplishment. And so what I'll say is there's a number of ways that I would think about sort of teaching text with a film like Defiance. First of all, you have organizations like the Jewish Partisan Educational Foundation, JPEF, which I think you can easily find online, that has some excellent supplementary materials that can go with Defiance. So what could be an excellent tool to do is you use a feature film like this, but then use survivor testimonies or audiovisual testimonies of survivors to teach the experiences of the Bielskis or people who were rescued by the Bielskis. So you could go to the Visual History Archive of the Shoah Foundation, do a search for somebody who was rescued by the Bielskis, have your students do that research, find the testimony, watch the testimony, then juxtapose that with the film, right? Like an interesting way to do that. Yeah, somebody points out, so the term "the banality of evil" is about the Eichmann trial. Yes, just to clarify, I just want to make sure that that's clear to everyone. I was referencing, so Hannah Arendt's thesis of the banality of evil, she writes specifically in reference to the trial of Adolf Eichmann. But what I mean is sort of that fascination with the bureaucratic nature of the final solution, the bureaucratic nature of the organization of mass murder. A film like The Conference or Conspiracy about the Wannsee Conference does sort of challenge some of those ideas about, were these just bureaucratic killers? How much were they thinking about mass murder? Which, of course, they were thinking about mass murder. It challenges that idea of Eichmann's defense at the trial, but also like can get students to think about how casually, essentially, these Nazi elites, representatives of the government, could think about trying to plan for the murder of 11 million Jews, right? Because they're thinking about every single Jew that they can get in Europe, including Great Britain, and do it so casually while sitting around lunch in a villa outside of Berlin, right? So it is the banality of evil, but it's also sort of challenging our students to think about what that actually means. Perry writes in about the very, very end of Schindler's List. So not that scene that I showed about sort of presenting the ring to Oskar Schindler, but then the fast forward to the present, essentially, where the generations place stones on the grave, and sort of that idea of the impact of Schindler's rescue, that it's not just the Jews who are rescued who are on the list, but the generations that come after, and paying tribute to Oskar Schindler in the cemetery where he is buried in Jerusalem, which, Spielberg, it's quite jarring to think about that the whole film is in black and white, of course, to transport the viewers to the past, but then he takes us back into color in the present. Essentially, what's the present? I mean, it was 1993, but right to the contemporary time to think about the lasting legacy. Irene asks about The Brutalist. I must confess, I have not seen The Brutalist yet. I have to dedicate 3.5 hours, I guess, and I have not found the time to do that yet. JS writes in, disappointment in the film. I'm assuming you're referencing One Life. And I do think that I saw it on an airplane, and I think the film does not do justice to the incredible story. There's fictionalizations, there's dramatizations. It could be an effective way to just introduce students to the remarkable nature of Nicholas Winton. There's actually a better film, I think, that is not in English and does not have Anthony Hopkins. It's called Nicky's Family, and it tells the story. I don't even know if they paid tribute to Nicky's Family, but I think it was originally done in Czech, I want to say. And it's a wonderful film that tells the story of Nicholas Winton and his rescue, and does it more effectively. But it's not a Hollywood feature film. Okay. Marcy writes in, List is far too heroic in its portrayal of Schindler. Totally agree. So again, if we think about sort of the gray areas of characters, right? Simplistic representations of heroes and villains. There's a lot. So this is the thing, right? What you can do with students, and Schindler's List also has a lot of violence, right? So again, I don't want to just say that's a blanket for everyone. I know that different schools have different considerations of what you can show your students. but there's a lot of violence that's represented in the film. In particular, sort of the juxtaposition of Oskar Schindler and Amon Goeth. And what we know what Spielberg's trying to do there, right? Which is to show like ultimate evil, and that all German, so Amon Goeth, Ralph Fiennes' character in the film, is ultimate manifestation of evil, and is just sort of, and this is, I think, an accurate representation of what we know about the Commandant of Plaszow of Amon Goeth. But he uses it also to juxtapose sort of this almost this religious transformation that takes place within Oskar Schindler, in which he becomes this sort of heroic rescuing figure that does have, I think, certain sort of it's yeah, somebody writes in the accomplishments of Schindler's wife Emily are totally left out. Also, right, Polanski has been canceled as an accused rapist for statutory rape. He cannot return to the United States. I mean, these are things for us to wrestle with in terms of thinking about The Pianist. And I'll just say, so, right, yeah, students should know. You're right, Marcy, right? It's a question of how do we deal with that reality. Yeah, I won't go into Woody Allen films as well, but like these are questions that we have to think about when we think about art versus the artist. Okay, so JS writes in, how do you suggest showing some of these films during class time for homework? Excellent question, and I'm glad you brought this up. And I meant to talk about this in my presentation, right? So, I hesitate because I know that we might have limited class periods. I don't think that it's good to use, let's say you have a 40-minute class period, to use 3 class periods on a film. At the same time, you probably need to tell parents if you're going to be assigning students to watch a film as homework, right? And so that's like another issue to think about. So one thing that can be done is, for example, if you have a lesson plan that is going to focus on, I want to teach my students about history, right? And that's the goal of this lesson that I'm constructing, that I want them to learn the history of the Holocaust. And so, and I want them to learn about sort of different aspects of German experiences and German Jewish experiences of the Holocaust, right? So, Alan, in the chapter on understanding and teaching the Holocaust, he picks 3 films to design a lesson plan around. Europa, so you get the experience of Solomon Pearl, who manages to survive essentially with an assumed identity during the war. Amen, which tells the story of Kurt Gerstein, who has sort of moral and ethical dilemmas around the use of Zyklon B and is transformed, and The Counterfeiters. And he says, okay, you take these 3 films that show different aspects of the history, specifically as it relates to Germany, but you also sort of give students preparation where they might see a map of Europe. They might see locations that Solomon Pearl travels to. And then you show clips in class, right, to represent that. So if they can, as homework, watch it, on their own time, and then you can have the time in the class to just show certain clips as triggers for them to then discuss it, then it can supplement sort of the history they're trying to teach them with then active discussion in class. Sorry, there's so many great questions coming in, Paul. I'm just trying to catch up on and I love this. I love the responses. I see. I'll just mention some of the questions that have come in. Romy mentions using the memory project to focus on specific topics related to reading. Is there a feature film that would be appropriate for junior high school students? It's a really good question. So there's a few films that I could suggest that deal with sort of the history of the war, but I think are sensitive to sort of a student audience. So I'll give you one example that is based on. So it's called Run Boy Run. It came out in 2013, I want to say, and Run Boy Run deals with sort of one child's experiences. It's based on a memoir of a child who managed to survive during the war, manages to escape a roundup and go into hiding, and then has survived sort of through the graces of different farmers. I think it's sensitive to kind of the sensitivities of middle school audience. You could definitely assign that the memoir and the film together is one example that comes to mind immediately, but there are others. Great question about films on homosexuals during the Holocaust. I have to think about that and come back to it because I think that is a great question. Sorry. Okay, more. There are questions about Anne Frank, and some of you have seen. Some of you may have seen the exhibit that's at the Center for Jewish History on the annex, the recreation of the annex. So one of the things that's interesting, if you've had a chance to go see it, is then you will see at the end of the exhibition, there have been many representations of Anne Frank on film. And I think it's a really interesting, could be a really interesting project to do with students, to have them read the diary, the unabridged sort of comprehensive versions of the diary, not the 1950 edited version of the diary, 1955, but the more comprehensive version, but then to compare it to film representations. And this could be quite interesting for students to think about sort of what accounts for the popularity of Anne Frank? Why would Anne Frank become a universal symbol of sort of man's inhumanity to man, or the idea of like, I want to believe that at heart all humans are good, right? Sort of the way in which it's represented, what is emphasized and what is left out. So if your students are at a level where they can think quite critically about these representations, which, by the way, let's face it, I didn't say this, but our students consume so much media content that to get them to think critically about the media content that they're consuming, right? Why is this packaged in the way that it's packaged for you? What does the filmmaker want you to take out of it? What are they leaving out? What is the story that they're trying to tell you? Could be incredibly valuable to do for our students. Okay, sorry, going through a lot. Somebody mentioned Saving Private Ryan. Amy mentions Saving Private Ryan and says, while flawed in some ways, would also be a good choice. Yes, what I will say is, there's a lot of films that deal with the history of the Second World War, and we should, right, distinguish films that deal with the history of the Second World War from films that deal with the history of the Holocaust, right? So I think that's interesting to think about sort of those distinctions. Yes, I think Saving Private Ryan can be incredibly effective in teaching our students about World War II. You can think about sort of the different characters represented in the film, the different soldiers, the Jewish soldier, right? The character of the Jewish soldier, the sort of mission to save. So it does a good job of teaching about D-Day. And what I'll say is quite important, right? That whole scene from the beginning of the film of D-Day. Our students, right, we have to remember, like, they have very limited knowledge of the history of the Second World War, let alone the history of the Holocaust. So all of these could be used as effective ways to teach this history and develop historical literacy. Band of Brothers. So for those of you who have access to HBO Max, one season, right, which is sort of a Saving Private Ryan extended version. There is an episode that deals with the liberation of the camps from Band of Brothers, and I think can be used. It does an excellent job of representing the liberation of the camps and can be used for that. Again, taking into account the sensitivities of what you can and cannot show in a classroom setting. I totally understand that it's not going to apply for everyone. Elisa mentions Shoah. So here's what I'll say about Shoah and Claude Lanzmann. I use this in, so I teach PhD students. I do graduate seminars on the Holocaust. I do a graduate seminar on the use of survivor testimony, which we're going to have the documentary. And then in my last session on May 4th, I'll talk about using survivor testimony in the classroom. So Paul, I might come back to this. But what I'll say is it's tricky to use Shoah. First of all, because of its length, obviously. But for example, I'm thinking about certain scenes that could be very effective to use in the classroom. So the one that comes to mind immediately for me is Avraham Bomba, the barber, who was forced to cut the hair of Jews as they were being brought to Treblinka. And then Claude Lanzmann essentially sets up a barbershop scene for him to talk about those experiences while he's cutting the hair of actually this is all essentially, it's a documentary, but Lanzmann sets the scene almost in a fictionalized sense for the purpose of the documentary film. It's an incredible scene because you can see Bomba wrestling with the traumatic past as it comes up in his attempt to deal with this memory. And I think it's extremely, extremely powerful. We can talk about it in a few weeks when we talk about using survivor testimony in the classroom. Okay. Yes. Paul, somebody asked about a transcript. You're recording this. So then once the recording is complete, you will get a transcript of both the chat and then this will be recorded also. So some of the suggestions that we have for comparison should be included as well. Yeah. So Mark Wilner mentions the film about the Warsaw Ghetto Revolt. Exactly. So John Voight plays Jürgen Stroop, the commander of the suppression of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. That is Uprising, the NBC film that was created to document the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. I don't include it in feature films because it was essentially like a made for what those of us who are old enough to remember will remember made for TV movies. It was a made for TV movie, just like Escape from Sobibor in the 1980s was a made for TV movie about the revolt at Sobibor. Actually, not bad considering sort of 1980s film quality, but I think it does a decent job of telling the history of Sobibor. What I will say about what I heard about the attempt to dramatize the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in a feature film is that the rights for such a project at one time were owned by Harvey Weinstein. And that may be the reason that we still don't have like that great, Hollywood film about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Yeah, When Hitler Stole Pink Rabbit is another example. Yes, I'm so glad that this was mentioned. It's a recent film, When Hitler Stole Pink Rabbit. I think could work very well for middle school students. Some of you will remember the sort of basically children's book, right? About sort of a child's experiences during the war. I think could be very, very effective for middle school students. Somebody else suggests A Friendship in Vienna to teach about the Anschluss. Elisa mentions, I remember the TV miniseries, The Holocaust, which if I was doing a whole thing on like the history of film representations of the Holocaust. So yes, 1978, Holocaust, the miniseries, right, was a real turning point in representations of the Holocaust in film. Meryl Streep, Elie Wiesel very famously objected strenuously to this representation of the Holocaust on film, specifically because he said this has the danger of trivializing the Holocaust. And that's a whole other conversation, right? But we can think about how far we've come in almost 40 years to nobody questions whether or not it's appropriate. I don't think most people do not question whether or not it's appropriate to represent the Holocaust on film. Romy mentions the episode of Band of Brothers, Why We Fight. That's the episode about liberation, Why We Fight. Okay, and Perry mentions that Larry Langer also objected to Holocaust as kitsch. Totally agree. Okay. All right. I think we are up against time.
I think we are too, but Avi, thank you so much for really wonderful presentation. And you did a fantastic job going through the questions. So I think you did it much more expeditiously than I would have. So I really appreciate that. So let me just make some concluding remarks, and then we'll let everybody go for the evening. So I want to thank everybody for joining us today. An evaluation should be coming out, an evaluation form and CTLA application should be on its way to your mailbox, your email box shortly. Again, this is our latest installment of the Finding Goddesfeld Heller and Joseph Heller Professional Development Series, which is made possible through the sponsorship of Dr. Jacqueline Heller in memory of her parents, and also through the support of the Jewish Conference Material Claims Against Germany. For more information and to register for any of the upcoming events, please check your email. For our e-blast, you could tell your friends about the program. Also, they could come and join us on the second installment, which will be about using documentary films to teach about the Holocaust. And Avi is going to be speaking again about using recorded survivor testimony on our last session, and we might be able to address some other questions that I see. I see there are more questions coming up than there is time to answer them, which is great, which is really great. So Avi, thank you so much. Everybody here, thank you so much. Have a great evening, and looking forward to seeing you hopefully on our next one.
Great. Thanks,
Take care,
Paul.
everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.